Okay, welcome, Ramon. Um, we are discussing the theoretical framework of decolonial theory in relation to studying revolutions of liberation. And we studied the Russian Revolution, and we were about to go into the effect of the death of Stalin and what it meant for MCSR in evaluating Marxist theory in relation to Black thinking. But we have to do that another time, because I think our sessions are theoretical sessions, are sessions to look into long-term aspects of understanding the world we live in. And now with the onslaught of Zionist military apparatus on Gaza and the people of Palestine, it is more than ever important to take a long-term view of how we look at the struggle of the Palestinians theoretically, and how do we see it develop in the coming years. That gives us also insight into how we use theory, decolonial theory, to understand current political problems and even military problems. Okay, now let me start with the question of how this will end. How will the apartheid state of Israel end? Some people might think it will never end, because it has been there for 70 years. It's a mighty military power. And how can it end? Because they have no imagination of how history deals with injustice. And history deals with injustice in a way where sooner or later justice prevails, and then is being attacked again. And there's another injustice. Now, my view on this, and I appreciate your critique and your analysis, is as follows. The project of setting up a colonial state in Palestine, as Hatem Bassian explained in his book, It's Something Colonial, Palestine, it had initially nothing to do with the Jewish Holocaust. It was just a project of long before World War II, where Zionists tried to take over land of Palestine. And then with the support of the British, they did and get it. And after World War II, they established the state of Israel as a colonial settler state. And because of the victory in the 1976 war and the military build-up and the immense support financially, military, ideologically, politically by the Western powers, basically the only solution that was thinkable after in the time when Arafat started to do the negotiation, the only solution was two-state solution. But the Zionists were never bent on it, never wanted a two-state solution, wanted a solution where basically the other state would be just a vassal state of Israel. Now, Israel has about 9 to 10 million people. About 20% of them are Arabs living within Israeli borders. So my view of how the apartheid state of Israel will disappear is basically in two scenarios. One is the inner disintegration of Israel. And there are two factors which will contribute to that. One factor is the demographics of Israel. Because what this war shows is you can build a wall to separate the people from the West Bank. But you can't build walls in every city within Israel. You can't build a wall within Tel Aviv, So what it showed, the violence within the cities, is that there will never be peace in Israel. And that will bear on the morale of the Israeli people. And that morale will enable a split within the Israeli population of people with decency and morality who will see that this is not sustainable. That percentage of that people is very low now, but I think it will grow, where sensible people within Israel will realize that apartheid is not sustainable. That's one factor. The second factor is that if the two-state solution is now gone, then a military option, of which the Israelis thought that they had the upper hand because of all their technological experience and the financing and the weaponry, etc. A military solution is the other option that might force them to dismantle that state. We can't imagine it now. Just as the South Africans couldn't imagine when the Soweto uprising was there, that 30 years later the apartheid state was dissolved. But how would that military solution look like? And what we have seen now is that if you look at the war that was the last war in Lebanon, which Israel lost, they thought they never lose a war. They will never lose a war, but they lost the war with Hezbollah, and they lost it militarily, and not just morally. They lost it militarily, which is important. And now we see that while in previous Intifada they used to throw rocks, now they are throwing bombs from Gaza, and are becoming sophisticated. And the bombs itself will not lead to a military victory, but it will have impact on the morale of the people, because the idea that the super dome shield could get 100% of the rockets doesn't work, and even the 10% is already a big blow for the morale. They wanted to go into Gaza with infantry, etc. They hesitated because they know the lessons of Lebanon, and they have been in Gaza. They occupied Gaza, and they know what the impact is. And then the geopolitics. The geopolitics has changed dramatically in the last years. The United States have acknowledged their defeat in Afghanistan. They were defeated in Syria. They are being defeated in Iraq. So the geopolitics, despite the efforts to get the Arab regimes led by Saudi Arabia co-opted in the solution of Trump, which was an economic solution, the idea that if you create the economic solution, jobs for the Palestinian, that there would be no resistance. That turns out to be nonsense. The new geopolitical situation makes a military solution in the sense that a sustained military conflict where the Palestinian resistance can decide how long it will take and thus have impact on the morale of the Israelis. And of course, the new international situation where for now everybody, in the West keeps silence, but we'll see how the solidarity movement will develop. So my idea is that what I've seen in the last week is the possibility of the disintegration of the apartheid state of Israel. That it is a real possibility which we couldn't imagine before. That's my take on the thing. So I'm curious about to how you view it.
Yeah. Well, first, there is always a correlation between settler colonialism and genocide. There's always a correlation because the settler colonialism is not so much interested in the exploitation of labor of the people they colonize. They're more interested in taking over their land, their territory, their resources, and occupying it with the, colonizers' families taking over. In Israel, the Israeli colonial racist state is very obvious. They are taking over houses, literally houses. They're taking the houses and then putting there a settler colonial family to live in the house where Palestinians were living 2 days ago, and have been living there for, hundreds of years. And so settler colonialism is about ethnic cleansing. And this is not said by me. This is the study about this has been done by Israeli historians themselves, like the work of Ilan Pape, for example, and others have demonstrated that from the beginning, the project was ethnic cleansing of the territory and taking over land, resources, houses, buildings, everything from the Palestinians. And as you said, this began way before because it was a British project. And we need to remember that the project of Zionism, the British embraced it because of anti-Semitism. The British and the Europeans wanted a final solution for the Jewish question in Europe. And for them, the final solution was to export them to Palestine as a settler colonial project. And that way they get rid of the Jews from Europe, and at the same time, they support them in a colonial project over there that they could become then a bastion for Western imperialism in Arab Muslim lands. This is a perverse Machiavellic kind of thinking, that the British put forward in 1917. And I think it was called the Balfour Treaty or something like this. And so this policy went on way before Second World War. And then before Hitler went on with the concentration camps, there were Jewish Zionist leaders meeting with Hitler and trying to get an agreement of a final solution. That will be the Zionist project of occupying the land in Palestine. And, they were in negotiations with the Nazis and with Adolf Hitler on this. But of course, Hitler went on for the final solution as extermination rather than exportation or expelling the population, so and then the the growth of Jewish population in the territory of Palestine began to grow big numbers during the British, and especially after Second World War, when they start sending all the refugees of the war and so on, during and after Second World War to Palestine, and as a kind of final solution, even after Second World War, even after the concentration camps, even after all of that, the anti-Semitism of the European empire was so huge that even the countries opposed to the Nazis were all friendly to the idea of getting rid of the Jews from Europe and exporting them to Palestine. So that's what they were doing. Then they took advantage of the Holocaust to push Jews to move to Palestine, you see? And remember that Jews in Palestine in the early 20th century were only 2% of the population, 2%. And those 2%, they consider themselves Palestinian Jews. They didn't deny Palestinian identity. That's something that came later. And even many of the descendants of Palestinian Jews continue calling themselves Palestinian Jews. So a lot of the people who occupied the land there were European Jews, the great majority, especially in the early part of the process. And so from the beginning, you have there a solution, the anti-Semitism of Western Europe, looking for a solution of the Jewish question by getting rid of them through one solution was extermination, and the other one was exportation. And the exportation one was the one that the Zionist project was embracing with the support of the British from the beginning, and then the support of everybody else of European empires after that, including USA, after Second World War. And then you have, of course, so you have a racism that tried to solve its problem from a racist point of view through the exportation of Jews out of Europe. And then you have the constitution of a colonial racist state in Palestine that is now doing to Palestinians what Europeans were doing to Jews. Okay, so look at the entanglement here and the sequence of oppressions, of entanglement of oppressions here, and how one oppressed group tried to solve its oppression by oppressing other groups, and doing to Palestinians what Europeans were all along doing to them. So it's really a very perverse and, how can I say, entangled oppressions here, where instead of, this shows how there's no project of liberation if a people try to liberate themselves from an oppression by oppressing other people. It shows that that's not the solution, because you're just going to keep moving forward. So, for example, anti-Semitism in Europe is not yet solved, okay? You cannot say this is solved completely. It's been displaced against Muslims now, and the whole focus is on Muslims rather than Jews. But if you look at the narrative they're mobilizing against Muslims in Europe, it's very similar to the anti-Semitism of the 1930s and 40s in Europe. And some of the measures, like this law of anti-separatism of Macron, is just following similar measures of the Vichy government in France, following the occupation of the Nazis, against Muslims now, so what they were doing to Jews is now being done to Muslims. So it just shows that you don't solve a problem of a racist oppression by you becoming now an oppressor elsewhere, and doing the same thing to other people, okay? And so we need to understand that Jews, the majority of Jews in the world, didn't go along with this. There was a lot of opposition in the early period, especially to the constitution of the state of Israel, you know, because for the Jews, it was an absurdity. This idea of a homeland or a state, creating a state over there, and so on. So, and even for religious reasons, a good portion of Jews were also opposed to it, to the constitution of Israel as a state. And so Zionism, you cannot say Zionism today is a Jewish project. Zionism is also Christian. A lot of Christians in the West are backing up, financing and supporting the Zionist project for their own reasons, narratives, Protestant, fundamentalist narrative about the second coming of Christ, where they're saying that when greater Israel is finally achieved, that's when Christ will come back and things like this, okay? They're as anti-Semite as the Europeans and even the Nazis. They're just, for very bizarre reasons, they are justifying the Zionist project right now, but they are super anti-Semitism in relation to Jews. These Christian fundamentalist Protestant groups in the US and in Britain. And so then you have, of course, the ethnic cleansing and occupation, you know, colonial racist occupation of Palestinian territories and people, you know, and with dispossession and violence as a constant. And that's a quintessential definition of racism. When you have a institutional racism operates through dispossession and violence, not as an exception, but as a constant. That's what the Palestinians have been living over now a century after the British began in 1917 this project of settler colonialism, with European Jews sending them to occupy the land of Palestine in over there. So now you have how slowly the project of Zionism is taking over and expelling, taking over land, territory, resources, building houses from Palestinians, and slowly expelling them from the territory to the, that's called ethnic cleansing in international law. This is acknowledged as a form of genocide, but it's the veto of USA in the United Nations that impede us from saying officially today in the United Nations that this is a form of genocide. Every time this is discussed, there is a veto from USA. And of course, Israel is a bastion of the military industrial complex, of the intelligence, technology, and aggression of Western imperialism over Arab lands, and Arab Muslim territories. So this is why they defend the state of Israel very strongly, because they consider Israel as an important military ally to the West. And they're also entangled in military and intelligence technology. I mean, the Israelis have developed a lot of intelligence technology of which the West today is highly dependent. So look, the Israelis are training the police in the USA. You saw the violence in Colombia today. Well, the Israelis have been training the Colombian army, okay, and the Colombian police. So Israelis are becoming like the part of the police of the world. They are of the imperialist system. They work on the area of security and policing of populations, and they have developed technologies and knowledge about this to oppress people. I mean, and for them, Palestinians are a laboratory of that. And this technology they use against Palestinians is now being used in the cities of the USA. You know, that's where Black Lives Matter emerged, where you see all this militarization of police departments in many cities of USA, where they're just killing people in the streets, like Israelis are doing to Palestinians. And this is, so you have, in a sense, the Palestinization of the world, okay? The Palestinization of the world, because the technologies of repression used against Palestinians are the laboratory of the technology they're exporting to many parts of the world today. And it's being used and embraced by US empire and European empire. And, and the entanglement of the interests of Western imperialism with the Zionist project is such that they just go along with consenting to all these atrocities and all this double standard. Is so obvious to the world today that they cannot, they just have to lie. Every time they try to talk about this, there is a press conference done by the spokesperson of the State Department a few days ago. There's a video there. And you could Google it. It's published in YouTube, and a newscast called TRT World. They put there that a video. I have circulated it myself, where they show the State Department spokesperson, obviously defending the right of self-defense of Israelis. But then when the press asks him about the right of self-defense of Palestinians, the guy he cannot answer the question. He has to evade the question. You see, because it's a double standard, complete double standard. You have the Israelis killing people, and then when people try to defend themselves, then they go and kill more people. And then the whole discussion begins not from the action of the Israelis, but from the reaction of the Palestinians. And the previous action of the Israelis is never discussed by the press. It's always the reaction, the beginning of the conversation. Oh, Hamas is throwing, rockets into Israel. That's the beginning of the discussion. And of course, Israel, the sequence of the arguments, Israel has the right to defend itself, right? And that's it. They don't begin the discussion where it should begin. Settler colonialism, dispossession, racism, apartheid. This is an apartheid system. It's recognized even by Jimmy Carter, okay? Ex-president of the USA is recognized by Human Rights Watch, recognize it. There are human rights organizations that has always been working for the West, now even recognizing that in Palestine, saying that, Israelis are practicing apartheid, so it's just, today it's not the left saying this, it's mainstream organization, even someone like Jimmy Carter, that you cannot say is from the left, so this is so overt, so overt. And the question is, until when they're going to continue lying to themselves and to the world, with this thing, this entity called Israel, that is really a settler colonial state practicing apartheid, racist apartheid in an overt way, and practicing genocide, because this is ethnic cleansing. This international law very clearly stated as a form of genocide. So, so anyway, it's happening in our eyes, in primetime TV. You could see this happening every day in our noses. This is what happened in previous centuries with indigenous people, for example, in the USA, or indigenous people, the European settler colonialism in North America, in Canada, in USA, in Australia, New Zealand, in South Africa, Okay, in many parts of the world, you have this settler colonial project that is highly associated and correlated with genocide. And you can say that there were, and here is maybe where I might disagree with you. You can say there are successful models of genocide, settler colonialism, and genocide. For example, USA, Australia, Canada. In a sense, they were successful at bringing so much white European population, overwhelming numbers demographically. They were successful at extermination, eliminating millions of indigenous people they encountered in the colonial project, defeating them militarily, isolating them in reservations, you know, and then occupying the rest of the land with European settlers. So that's kind of a successful model of settler colonialism and genocide. And I'm saying successful, not because they don't have problems, not because there might be a demise of these empires in the next decades, as I see coming, for example, the potential of that coming in the USA that we have discussed in other programs, the demise of the US empire. But in terms of the settler colonialism vis-a-vis indigenous populations, these are successful models because they were able to bring and import millions and millions and millions of European settler colonial families. And that's how they were able to outgrow the population of the indigenous people by genocide and by overwhelming importation of population from Europe. Now, in Israel, there are particularities of the process of Israel that makes it more difficult to be a successful model. One limitation is that they haven't been as successful as they would like to be in bringing overwhelming number of Jews from other parts of the world. Just the fact, and this is where it's important to understand, the Palestinian resistance has been so important, even without being able to so far winning the war, okay? They have been successful in the resistance to the point that many Jews from other parts of the world who would like to move to Israel, they think it twice, okay? They don't even consider the idea of going there because they see some of them are opposed to it, okay? But there are others that might be in sympathy, but then when they see the atrocities done by the Israeli state, when they see the resistance of Palestinians, they are like, do I want to be there? You know, do I want to be part of this? And that brings second thought to many of them. So they haven't been successful as the cases of Australia or New Zealand or Canada or USA or other places where they have an overwhelming majority of the population occupying the land and making very difficult for indigenous people to be able to have a project for the future, you see. In South Africa, that's an example where they were not able to outnumber the indigenous populations of South Africa. And look at the end result of apartheid system was that it ended up in a demise because it couldn't work forever when you have a minority of white population there. Now, in the case of the state of the colonial racist state of Israel, you have, so far they have a very bare majority, but it's not that big of a number. In the long term, the demographic of Palestinian, demographic growth of Palestinian is the estimates are they're going to outgrow the Israeli population. Right now, the people in the West Bank or Gaza. They make millions of people, okay? And if you add the 20% of Palestinians inside the Israeli state, they're almost even in terms of numbers, you know, and Israelis might have maybe 1 million or 1 million or something else ahead, or 2 millions, but that's not going to last forever because the growth of Palestinian population in terms of demographic growth is going at fastest and larger rates than the Israeli population. So in a matter of, you know, a decade or two, they will outnumber again, you know, the Israeli population. And then there is another factor, which is that settler colonial people cannot take, I mean, they're occupying the land, they come to take over resources, to fulfill their dreams and have a good life, etc. But they're not ready psychologically nor physically to be under a situation where they have to be hiding in bunkers, you know, because there might be a rocket falling in their heads, okay? That psychologically, they cannot start. Then you have 1 or 2 Israeli deaths, that's for them a big thing. That's why they're thinking twice about entering again into Gaza, because they know that the numbers of Israeli soldiers dying is going to be huge. And they know the impact this has on a settler colonial state such as Israel, where they know that psychologically the settler colonials cannot take a war, cannot take death bodies, you know, cannot take the psychology of being, you know, worried the whole time if a rocket is going to fall in their heads, okay? Even if it never fall in their heads, because the military capacity of the resistance has increased, but doesn't come even close to the military power of the Israelis. I mean, the Israeli is one of the most powerful military states in the world. So when in the press, they talk about clashes and they talk about Palestinian Israelis as if there was a war that was, I'm sorry, this is not a war. This is an abuse of force. What you have is resistance to an abuse of force. War is when you have 2 equal partners, 2 equal forces, not partners, forces fighting each other. But this is an abuse of force where they're using all kinds of technologies, bombs, weapons, you know, missiles, airplanes. How do you call those ones that are like drones? No, they're using all the technology, and the Palestinians, what do they have? They have a few rockets that now have the capacity to trick the defense system of Israel, and now are falling in the ground in some places, and have capacity to reach now cities like Tel Aviv and Jerusalem that before they couldn't reach that far, and have the capacity to trick the defense system to the point that some of these rockets cannot be stopped by the defense system of Israel and fall in the ground, and with very few casualties for the Israelis, okay? So we cannot, and then what do they have? Stones, and these rockets, okay? In terms of defense. That's all, nothing else, okay? Now, is this a war? I have difficulties calling this a war, you know, because it's as if you have 2 forces with equal footing fighting each other. I'm sorry, this is not the case. We're talking about a super powerful, one of the most powerful military machines in the world against the people that have a few rockets and stones. I mean, this is an abuse of force from all points of view. Not to talk about what we already talked, genocide, ethnic cleansing of territory, taking over their houses in East Jerusalem, which is the center of the struggle right now. they've been taking over the houses of Palestinian families that have been there living for centuries. And the apartheid state is going after their houses and expelling the families from their houses and then having sellers occupying the house. You know, this is, you know, a form of dispossession that they've been practicing all along, you know. And so what I'm trying to say is that how to foresee now, answering your question, I can see several scenarios from which this could fall. One is that as the resistance improve a little their military resistance, the settler colonial families there cannot resist a few people dying. I mean, that not compare at all in numbers to the number of Palestinians dying every day, okay? But the settler colonial mentality, they cannot take like a situation of constant attacks through rockets. They cannot take a few soldiers dying or a few part of the population dying. They immediately get very scared, psychologically demoralized, etc. So this could create a situation where at some point, some of them might fear for their life and start considering packing up and leaving. Okay, so this is one scenario that you can see happening and reducing significantly the growth of the population of the state, of, you know, of the settled colonial population. You can see also, so in that sense, there could be a situation where it become unmanageable, like happened to the white elite, apartheid white elite in South Africa, that, you know, running South Africa became unmanageable for them. And the international pressure plus this resistance, local resistance, forced them to have to dismantle the apartheid system. Something that also happened in the USA, where the resistance of Black people plus the international pressure forced the USA to have to get rid of it, okay, because it was creating a situation of unmanageable, you know, where they couldn't manage the country, and a situation where through international pressure, you know, like for example, the boycott against South Africa forced the elites to have to give up on apartheid, not to lose their wealth, you know. So this kind of thing are there, but there is another one that we need to also consider, and that's the arrogance of Israel is such that they could make a big mistake at some point where you could have a situation with the president of Hezbollah in the south of Lebanon, where you could have a war coming from all sides, both from the Palestinian side as well as from the Lebanese side, that could create a situation where many settler colonial people, by the way, many of these settler colonial people have double citizenship. They have passports, European passports, American passport, and passport of other countries. Because remember, there's also a number of Sephardi Jews from Arab countries also there in Israel that have also their nationalities passports. And, you know, there's a good percentage of them with those passports that can easily one day pack up and leave, you know. And if they see themselves at risk, these people are not going to stay there to defend, you know, the settler colonial project. They're the first ones that are going to pack up and leave. And so I see the possibility also of, for on the one hand, an implosion where they will have to give up on the apartheid project and have to move to another system like it happened in South Africa, or a situation where through a war, there might be some kind of destruction of the Israeli state. For example, right now, you know that they're going crazy about the tunnels, of underground tunnels, both of Hamas and Hezbollah. And the population in Israel, for example, in the north part of Israel, they're going crazy because they feel that at some point, Hezbollah might show up, in their neighborhoods, at some point. And there are hundreds, if not thousands, of these tunnels, okay? And so this is something that no matter how much nuclear weapons you have, like Israel is one of those states that have a lot of nuclear weapons, but they don't recognize they're a nuclear power. They keep hiding this. Everybody knows it. But they go along with murder, doing all kinds of atrocities and violation of international law, including lying to the international organization about saying they don't have nuclear weapons because of the consent of Western imperialism, allowing them to do whatever. They have like a blank check, to do whatever. And so there could be a situation at some point where they can make a big mistake, and suddenly you could have inside Israel, inside Israeli territory, a fight, body to body, face to face, inside the territory. And you could have all the nuclear weapons you want, but the moment you have inside your territory something like that, you cannot throw a nuclear weapon against yourself. That's not useful. That doesn't work. You see what I mean? So you can threat other countries with that, but you cannot do that if this happens in your territory. Suddenly you have a war inside your territory. And there is another factor, which is that Israel is not, the territory they occupy, and they're trying to control. It's not a huge territory like Australia or USA. So there's so much population you can bring there, you see? And anything you do will affect everybody. So you cannot, you could use missiles, etc., but it has a limit how far you can go if suddenly you have a warfare happening right there inside your cities. They cannot throw a missile just like that. They can throw missiles to Syria, but they cannot throw a missile to Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, or you see what I'm trying to say? So this is where I see something that is right now difficult to imagine, but I see the possibilities because of their own arrogance, making a big mistake, and suddenly, like the mistake they made with this thing in Syria, they were backing up these jihadist takfiris, the takfiris, criminal organization, mercenaries, funds supported and finance and militarily equipped with, by the US empire, by a bunch of countries like Turkey, US empire, Saudi Arabia, Israel, etc. They were supporting this, and then they were defeated in Syria, and now Israel faced a more difficult situation because now Syria is a much stronger military country with the support of both Russia and Iran than it was before. And now they have, Iranian forces, even Hezbollah, not just Hezbollah in the south of Lebanon. Now they have it in the borders with Syria, so there could be a moment that is difficult to imagine right now where they provoke a situation where suddenly they will have the battleground inside Israel itself. And by the way, Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, has said in public that the next war, and you have to take the words of this guy seriously. Every time this guy says something, he mean it, okay? It's not metaphor, it's not, he mean it. And he said that in the next war with Israel, if Israel dared to invade Lebanon again, the fight is not going to be anymore inside Lebanon. It's going to be inside Israel. And remember, now Hezbollah is not just a guerrilla movement. It has a regular army that has been in the war in Syria has been becoming more strong than ever. In the war in Syria, they became now a regular army. So you're not dealing anymore with a small army. You're dealing with now a stronger army that, and he said next time we're going in. He said that we're going in to Israel and we're going to fight the war over there. And so take it seriously. He also said, if you attack us, we're going to attack some of the areas. Like there is a place in Haifa where they have chemicals, stored there, like a warehouse of chemicals. And he said, we're going to hit that. We have now Hezbollah has the capacity to hit anywhere in Israel, anywhere, with missiles, and has also the capacity to, they have also, how do you call the drones that fly over Israel. And they know that. So you could have all the technology of the world you want. You could have the best nuclear weapons you want, but that doesn't work if you have the battleground, your own territory, or close to you, enough close to you where you cannot use nuclear weapon. If you use a nuclear weapon, you're hitting yourself, you see? Because the territory there is small. It's not like USA or Australia or big, huge territories like that. So I'm saying this because I think Israel has its days counted. And the more they go into this aggressive policy, the more they're going to come close to its own demise, because they don't have and they will never have the numbers of a settler colonial project like the one that happened in North America or Australia. They will never have the numbers. They will never have the extensions of territories as to be able to do that. And therefore, what you're going to see in the next 10 years, 20 years, is the demise of the apartheid state of Israel. This is coming, with a force and faster than what we can ever imagine. And maybe, Al-Quds, Jerusalem, will be liberated from these Zionist colonial racist projects in our lifetime.
Okay, thank you very much, Ramón. Good to have this explanation. I think that the way you explain the nature of settler colonialism and the phase, the military capabilities and incapabilities of Israel points out to the fact that there is a possibility that the demise of the state of Israel can even come with military means, whether they like it or not. And that depends if this develops into a geopolitical war, where Iran and Syria and Lebanon gets involved, then it won't be that easy win like the 1967 war. It could develop into a totally different ballgame. Thank you very much for this contribution, and next time we'll move on depending on what happens in the world, but otherwise we'll pick up our discussion of developing the decolonial theoretical framework.
Okay, thank you, Du. Thank you very much.
All right, bye.
Take care.